And we are back here on GPS with Zanny, Minton, Beddoes, the editor-in-chief of The Economist, and Michael Fullilove, the executive director of Australia's Lowy Institute. Michael, so you have these new nuclear-powered subs. The Chinese, I'm sure, are not happy. But Australia and China have gone through some pretty rough times. The Chinese had those 14 demands, and then they blocked trade with Australia. Where do things stand now?
Well, Australia's relationship has changed a lot with China in recent years because China's changed. China's become much harder-edged, and they didn't like Australian policy, and they attempted a campaign really of economic coercion against Australia. It sort of petered out because of the high price of iron ore. There's been a change of government.
In
Australia. So what you have, certainly not in China. So what you have now is, from Australia, a dual-track policy, diplomacy and deterrence. On the diplomacy side, stabilising the relationship with China, ending the silent treatment, talks between leaders and foreign ministers, but also on the deterrence side, as you say, investing in new capabilities, including the nuclear-powered submarines that will give us more deterrent punch.
And trade is back to normal.
Well, trade actually, at a macro level, continued. At the macro level, it continued because of the high price of iron ore. There are still trade blockages on individual sectors and firms, but in general, trade didn't slow down, much to the consternation of the Chinese.
Zanny, how does this look in Europe? Because I keep hearing from European statesmen and businessmen that, look, Europe has to do business with China. They will not be able to join in an American blockade. But yet, the U.S. is pushing pretty hard. Where does all this end for Europe?
So I think there's a lot of questioning going on in Europe and a lot of soul-searching about where exactly the Europeans should be. And you will remember the very, very angry reaction in Europe to those comments of President Emmanuel Macron when he came back, basically saying, Taiwan was not a European issue. And so I think the Europeans are trying to work this out. And interestingly, I've noticed in the last few weeks a sort of tad of a change of rhetoric from Washington, which I think is designed to make it easier for the Europeans. In that speech from Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor that you described at the beginning of the show, where he laid out the Biden doctrine, if you will, he mentioned that the focus was not decoupling, but was, and he quoted Ursula von der Leyen, the European Union president, European Commission president, to say that it was de-risking. And when I was in Washington a couple of weeks ago, everybody was very keen to tell me that this was about de-risking, and that the US did not want decoupling, and Secretary Yellen had said the same thing. Now, the trouble is that all the other elements of the US strategy they like to use this analogy that the US needs a small yard with a high wall. And that has been widely interpreted to be using US economic weaponry to essentially keep China back in foundational technologies. And in Europe, there's a lot of concern about that, because on the one hand, I think there's growing recognition in Europe and growing worry about China. But on the other hand, as you say, particularly in countries like Germany, there's an incredible economic relationship with China. Companies like BASF and the German car companies essentially, wouldn't be at all where they were without China.
Zanny, briefly tell me, what is your sense of what is happening in China? Because you were in China recently for that annual China Development Forum. How do the Chinese perceive what's going on?
There is real anger. I was shocked, Fareed. I went back, as you say, a few weeks ago. I hadn't been there since 2019, 4 years. A real hardening and a sense that the United States is a bullying power determined to keep China down. They want us, one scholar said to me, to be a fat cat, not the tiger that the Chinese consider themselves to want to be. And I came back really very gloomy, having been both in Washington and in Beijing, that both sides see the other as a mortal threat in some ways, and that this is a really dangerous position to be in. Subsequently, there has, I think, been some attempt to moderate the rhetoric, but it's really grim out there. This is a relationship in terrible, terrible shape.
Michael, I have to ask you before we go, you are Australian, which means that King Charles is technically your head of state. What is that issue looking like in Australia? There had been a push for kind of republicanism and taking the British monarch off the European currency. Where do things stand, and what do you think? Do you think Charles will be the last royal head of state of Australia?
Well, let me say, look, I thought the images from London were incredible. They showed us again that no one does ceremonial like the Brits. I like Charles. I like his sense of humour. I think he was ahead of his time on the environment. But I'm an Australian, and I think that Australia's head of state should be an Australian, and I think most Americans would be sympathetic to that. So I wish Charles well, long live the King, but in the long term, I think our head of state should be one of us.
And is that what the what does the politics look like? What do the polls look like in Australia? Would most Australians share your views?
Look, I think if you expressed it that way, yes, but when you get into the interstices of what the model is and how we change the government, it becomes complicated. But I think when we look ahead, we have to be confident enough to have affection and fondness for Britain and for the monarchy, but ultimately know that our future depends on ourselves. And that means that all offices under the Australian Constitution, in my opinion, should be held by Australians.
Michael Fullilove, Zanny, Minton, Beddoes, always a pleasure to have you guys on. We will try to reconvene this global panel soon.